Welcome to How You Livin', a transformative podcast featuring best-selling author, inspirational speaker, and minister, Dr. Rick Rigsby. And now, Dr. Rick.
Hello, friends. Thanks so much for joining us. I want to talk to you about the foundation for greatness, the blueprint for any kind of success, the key to continuous improvement. Today, I want to discuss executing the basics. Now, you might not think that this topic is very sexy until you hear this. You'll never be great at anything unless you execute the basics. You'll be good. You'll even be pretty good, but you won't be great. My first lecture on the basics, I can tell you when it occurred. Back in 1972. At this point, I'm 16 years old. I've got a brand new job. That job would be my ticket to freedom. It would help me buy my first car. My job? I was a cook at Jack in the Box, that hamburger restaurant. This one happened to be in Northern California. I was either assigned to be on the counter or at the drive-through window or on the deep fryer. That's where you made French fries and tacos and hot apple turnovers. Or I'd be on the flat iron grill for burgers and breakfast sandwiches. The work was simple, but that did not stop my father from lecturing me on a daily basics. I can hear him right now. Son, what time does your shift start at Jack in the Box? Starts at 4 o'clock, Dad, right after school. Well, son, remember, you'd rather be an hour early than a minute late. Yes, sir, Dad. Son, how you do anything is how you do everything. Yes, sir. Son, it's never wrong to do the right thing. Yes, sir. Son, if you truly want to excel, execute the basics better than anybody else. You'll grow your capacity for that which you want. So, what are the basics? Back in 1972 at Jack in the Box, I would guess that the basics included cleaning the grill surface, changing the oil in the fryers, cleaning the filters in the stove vents, keeping the food properly refrigerated at the right temperatures, and repeating the order for the sake of order accuracy, making sure to say thank you to every customer. Stuff I never thought about when I'd go through a drive-through line. But trust me, there's nothing worse than a half-cooked burger served with fries that smell like tacos, handed to you with items that are missing in the bag, and handed to you by a rude server who didn't even have the common decency to say thanks. That's not the experience you want. Well, when I eventually got in my car, the lectures intensified. Oh, baby. Everything from checking the oil on a regular basis, to kicking the tires to make sure they were properly inflated, to never allowing the gas to drop below a quarter of a tank. The lectures never stopped. I hated them. I was like most 16-year-olds. I thought my dad was antiquated, outdated, old-fashioned, and completely irrelevant. Well, time would tell. I could not have been more wrong. To this very day, some 50 years later, friends, listen to me. The oil in my car is changed every 10 to 15,000 miles. The tires are rotated every 10,000 miles. My gas gauge never goes even below a half a tank. And despite the fact that tire quality has drastically improved over the decades, I still kick my tires, especially before long trips. I've got to determine with my own eyeballs the roadworthiness of each tire. And if that wasn't enough, as a husband, as a father, as a grandfather, I find myself sounding just like my dad as I repeat the very same lectures to every member of my family. Not so much to my wife. But the only difference is this. I get the same looks from my family members today that I wish I could have given to my dad. As a fast food consumer, mostly Chick-fil-A these days, guess what I've discovered? Cleaning the grill surface makes the food cook evenly. Who would have thought? Changing the oil in the fryers keeps the food tasting fresh. Cleaning the filters in the stove vent improves smoke intake. And refrigeration at the correct temperatures, that's just common sense. And repeating the order for the sake of order accuracy, making sure to say thank you to every customer, that's customer excellence. How many of you have ever left a drive-through line to discover that you don't have your complete order? You see, friends, regardless of your endeavor, regardless of your field, if you're not executing the basics, you're likely not functioning at the highest level you could function. Chuck Noll, remember that name, Chuck Noll. He was the head coach and architect of a football team in the 1970s in the National Football League. Noll had the unfortunate assignment of rebuilding a perennial loser, the Pittsburgh Steelers. And boy, did he succeed. To this very day, names like Bradshaw and Blyer and Harris and Swan and Ham and Lambert and Mean Joe Green, these are all names synonymous with sustained success, as in 4 Super Bowls in 1 decade. What was Chuck Noll's secret? 3 things: hard work, attention to detail, and focusing on the basics. Hard work, details, and basics. These are each reflected in Noll's mandate that he would repeat with his players on a regular basis. It's also one of my favorite quotes. It's found its way into most of my speeches. Here's what Noll said: champions are champions, not because they do extraordinary things, but because they do ordinary things better than anybody else. Let me repeat that. Chuck Noll said, champions are champions, not because they do extraordinary things, but because they do ordinary things better than anybody else. You need more proof? Consider John Wooden, that basketball coach at UCLA. He was called the Wizard of Westwood. He won 10 national championships, 7 in a row. That allowed him to recruit the best of the best, talent-wise, throughout the United States. Players like Sidney Wicks, Bill Walton, a young man out of Harlem named Lou Alcindor, who changed his religion and thus changed his name to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. On the first day of practice, Wooden starts teaching basics. His first basic: the proper way to put on your socks. Because if you don't know the proper way to put on your socks, your feet will develop blisters and you will be of no use to the team. How about the second basic? The proper way to tie your shoes. Because nothing stops a fast break like tripping over shoelaces. How about Bjorn Borg if you want more evidence of basics? My friend played against Bjorn Borg in the 1970s. My friend was a professional tennis player, and I asked him, who was your stiffest competition? He said, Borg. Absolutely at the top of the list. By the way, just for kicks and giggles, a great documentary to check out on Netflix, Borg versus McEnroe. It will really give you some great coaching points when it comes to the basics and pursuing excellence. Back to my story. My friend said Bjorn Borg was his stiffest competition. When I asked why, my friend simply said Bjorn Borg had the basics so down, he wore his opponents out. I have a friend right now who's waiting for a call from Major League Baseball. This friend is hoping to get that call that says he's been inducted into Major League Baseball's Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. And he told me recently, he said, if he gets the call, it will not be because of his home runs. It will not be because of his spectacular plays. It will be because of basic things like hitting the cutoff man. It will be because he was able to hit to the opposite side of the field with runners in scoring position. Basics. Just like one of the basics my dad taught me when I became an adult. He said, son, when you go into a restaurant for the very first time, order a bowl of soup. What? Why, Dad? Well, son, if the soup is not good, don't invest your money in the restaurant. Basics. If the restaurant can't do the basics of soups and sauces, you don't want to be a paying customer. I want to close with one of my absolute favorite stories relating to basics. It involves the legendary football coach, Vince Lombardi. First, a bit of backstory. How many of you realize that Lombardi was denied being a coach in the National Football League because of his ethnicity? The wisdom of the powers that be back in the 50s did not think an Italian had the mental capacity to lead a football team, but times changed and we're grateful. So Lombardi arrived in Green Bay, of all places, in Wisconsin, back in 1959. The Packers were coming off their worst season ever. They finished 1-10-1. That's one win, 10 losses, and a tie in 1958. They hadn't had a winning record in 11 years. I loved the way that Lombardi opened training camp, by the way, in 1959. Remember, this team the previous year couldn't even win a coin toss. But yet, he looked out at his players that first year, and he saw superstars. Just to give you an idea of what I mean, the following players on that 59 roster are now in the Hall of Fame in the NFL. They include Jim Taylor, Forrest Gregg, Bart Starr, Ray Nitschke, Herb Adderley, Willie Davis, Jim Ringo, Paul Hornung, and eventually Jerry Kramer in 2018 and Bobby Dillon in 2020. All of these Hall of Famers were members of that 1959 team, right? He was laying the foundation for basics. He told his new squad back in 1959, he said, "Gentlemen, we shall relentlessly pursue perfection, knowing full well we'll never catch perfection, but we shall relentlessly pursue perfection, and in the process, we'll catch excellence." Two thoughts before we finish the story, especially for those in leadership roles. Thought number one, make sure your expectations are clear and relevant. And thought number two, there's no such thing as a bad team, only bad leaders. For thought number two, my thanks to Jocko Willink and Leif Babin, two SEALs who wrote the bestseller, Extreme Ownership, How the Navy SEALs Lead and Win. They make the powerful argument that there's no such thing as bad teams, just bad leaders. So, back to our story. The rhetorical foundation had been laid. The expectations beginning in 1959 were clear. And on the field, the results spoke for themselves. In Lombardi's first year, his Packers went from 1-10 to 7-5. Lombardi was named Coach of the Year in 1959. It gets better. The following year, in 1960, the Packers almost win the NFL championship game, narrowly losing to the Philadelphia Eagles after blowing a lead in the fourth quarter. So, in 1958, the Packers go 1-10-1. In 1959, Lombardi's first year, the Packers go 7-5. In 1960, they receive a heartbreaking loss, but they make it all the way to the championship game. The stage is set for Lombardi to offer one of the greatest lessons on basics in history. It's now 1961. Your team reached the championship game the previous year. Now, 1961, the first day of training camp. The players were expecting to begin right where they left off, on the mountaintop. They were expecting to work on ways to advance their game. I'm sure they were expecting to learn fancy new plays and schemes that would design to help them win the championship. But when they sat down and began, Vince Lombardi simply held up a football and said, "Gentlemen, this is a football." He then had everyone open up their playbooks and start on page 1, where they began to learn the basics again, the fundamentals of blocking, tackling, throwing, and catching. That was clearly not what the players were expecting. They were on top of their game. They had been to the championship game just months earlier. But friends, this hyper-focus on basics allowed the Green Bay Packers to win the NFL championship that season with a 37-0 win against the New York Giants. Oh, by the way, Vince Lombardi went on to win 5 NFL championships in 7 years. He never coached a team with a losing season after that and never lost a playoff game again. Lombardi is considered among the greatest coaches ever, regardless of the sport. In fact, the Super Bowl trophy is called the Lombardi Trophy. Friends, if executing basics can elevate a championship team, imagine what it can do for us. If you allow me to sound like my dad for just a moment, perhaps we should stop looking for the next magic bullet, the next quick fix, the next 5 steps to success guide. Instead, how about focusing on fundamentals? Vince Lombardi won 5 NFL championships, 3 before they were called Super Bowls. Chuck Noll won 4 Super Bowls. That's a total of 9 championships in the National Football League. What's the secret? Hard work, attention to detail, and executing the basics. My dad never won a Super Bowl, but yet he was definitely my MVP. Often repeating from my earliest memories, son, you improve by executing the basics. Friends, the most successful people we know all have one thing in common. They never stop working on the fundamentals of their craft. And while the basics may not sound sexy, it sure does sound successful. Think about that for a few days. That's going to do it for this episode. Until we meet again, this is Dr. Rick, asking the most important question I can ask. How you living?
Are you ready to make an impact in your world right now? Do you want to stop existing and start living your best life right now? Dr. Rick wants to give you the first chapter of his best-selling book, Lessons from a Third Grade Dropout, absolutely free. Just go to www.rickrigsby.com/free gift to get the print or audiobook right now.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.